Unless you're a complete newbie, this video is going to be uber basic and uber boring. Now, while I would never encourage anybody to skip this video, you wouldn't hurt my self-confidence if you chose to this time. Hey everybody, Matthew here from My First Fish Tank in collaboration with Marine Depot, coming at you with week 16 in the beginner how-to guide for saltwater aquariums and reef tanks, adding sand and salt water to the display tank. We've already talked in depth about sand in week 14 and about salt water in week 15, so for more details about those, just check out the entire playlist below. We're only going to touch upon the extreme basics of mechanical filtration in today's video, just enough to get the cloudiness out of your water, but stay tuned for weeks 19 through 23 when we are going to take an extensive deep dive into all types of filtration for saltwater aquariums. Step 1 is adding your Aquascape. Now, you could add the sand first and the Aquascape second, but I like to add the Aquascape first. If you do add the sand first, unless you have a 1.5 or 2 inch deep sand bed, when you place that Aquascape on top, if it's not a super stable Aquascape, over time it's going to settle down so that the base of the rock eventually will settle on the glass bottom, and that little bit of settling could knock off some of the upper pieces of your Aquascape. So I always like to add the Aquascape first and then add the sand in. It's a little tricky though, because when you add the Aquascape in first, you have to be uber careful, and for some reason I really like saying uber instead of super today. You have to be super duper careful, because if you drop any of that rock onto the glass base of the tank, then you could cause a crack in that tank, and that tank's toast. It's gone. You're not going to be able to put water in a tank that has a cracked base. So you have to do it really, really carefully. And if you did add that sand bed first, that's not a really big deal, because if you were to drop a small piece of rock onto that sand bed, that will provide a little bit more cushion so you don't break the bottom of the tank. That all being said, I do like to add the Aquascape first, get it settled up exactly how I like it. Make sure there's space around the back, around the sides, enough for a magnetic algae scraper, and just get everything in perfect position before we move on to step 2. Now that you've added your Aquascape, we're going to move on to step 2, which is adding the sand. By this point, your sand's going to be wet. It's either wet because you bought the Live brand that comes wet with live nitrifying bacteria, or you went ahead and went with the Aragonite line of sand and you've rinsed it several times. Adding sand is really easy. Really just get a cup, get some sort of scoop, and scoop it in. The only real warning I have here, well, there's really 2 warnings. The first warning is don't just pour the sand in wet, because it's going to splatter. And you might think that's not a big deal. You get a little bit of splatter of sand on the glass walls. But I've noticed that when you add the water at the later step, sometimes little bits of that sand can stay on that glass even after it's full of water. And then the first time you grab your magnetic algae scraper and clean that glass, you'll hear this scraping sound, and your brand new tank will have its first scratch on its very first magnetic algae clean. So I would recommend using a cup, using some sort of device to scoop it in so you don't splash that sand onto the glass walls. It'll just allow you to get that first scratch at a much, much later date and not for your brand new tank. The other thing I would say is when you're adding that sand, obviously don't pour the sand on top of your Aquascape. Just put the sand around the base of the tank. Once all the sand is in there, you can just use your hands at this point. And I like to use my hands not only to even it out, but you're going to want to push it underneath that Aquascape. Hopefully you built your Aquascape in such a way that there's space underneath the Aquascape and it's not just one large flat rock that has no space below it. If you do have space below that Aquascape, just push some sand in there. If you don't fill it up completely, it's not a big deal, because over time various critters and just the wave motion inside the tank will spread everything out quite nicely. Step 3 is just to add your salt water. Now there's a few ways to do this, but the goal of adding your salt water in this step is to just not cause a huge sandstorm and to leave that sand bed relatively intact so you don't have to put your hand back in there and rework it. You can do this in one of 2 ways. If you're just going to use a pitcher, or if you're going to use a hose, you can use a plate. A plate works really well. Just place a plate right on top of a flat portion of your Aquascape or right on the sand bed, and then scoop the water in and pour it directly onto the plate. If you're using a 5-gallon bucket, then pour the 5-gallon bucket directly onto the plate. I personally like to use a pump and some flexible tubing, and then I'll just hold it directly above the plate. I mean, all a plate does is it just disperses that water so you don't create a huge sandstorm right in that one area where you're pouring all that water. Another really good method method is using a colander. Obviously, make sure you're using a colander that is super clean. I recommend not using any sort of kitchen gear in your aquarium system. Just keep those completely separate. Just go out and just buy a super cheap colander. You can either just hold the colander in your hand, or you can drape it over the side sometimes if it's a long enough colander, and then just pour the water directly into the colander, and it does the exact same thing as the plate. It disperses that water so you don't cause any sandstorms. Now that you have your water in, we're going to add your mechanical filtration. You're going to either add filter socks or some sort of fine mesh sponge. And the goal of the filter sock and the mesh sponge is really to get that water crystal clear, to polish it. There's going to be a little bit of floating debris in that sand, and there's also just going to be some cloudiness that wasn't rinsed out if you bought the Aragonite sand, or that just came as a part of the Live brand. So go ahead and install either the filter sock or the sponge. You are going to leave those in for a couple days, but then you're probably going to want to take them out, rinse them off, and add them back in, because in the first 24 hours that filter sock and that sponge are going to get really clogged up with all sorts of debris. So rinsing them out after about 24 hours will really help the next 24 hours polish the water to be super clear. Unless you live in the desert like I live, where our entire house is 78 degrees all summer long, you're going to want to add a heater next. Just grab your heater, plug it in, set it to whatever temperature you're going to have your tank at, usually somewhere between 77 and 78 degrees. If you bought a Bayite temperature controller or an Inkbird temperature controller, you could also connect that now just to monitor the temperature of your tank. But at this point, since we're not adding any livestock yet, it's not a big deal. We just want to get the temperature up to around 77, 78 degrees so that when it's ready for nitrifying bacteria and cycling, everything's just where we want it. Step number 6 is adding the return pump and the flexible tubing. If you went with any of the all-in-one systems that we talked about, it came with a return pump and it came with all the tubing you need. Most of these are so easy because the return pump is already in the return chamber, especially with the innovative marine tanks, and it already has a flexible tubing attached. All you have to do is take the 90-degree elbow, thread it through the back weir, and then attach the flare nozzle or the lock line tubing to it, and you're good to go. If you bought a different tank from a different brand, just follow their instructions, and if you get stuck, you can always email Marine Depot customer service or email us, contact@myfirstfishtank.com. We're always here to help. At this point, it doesn't really matter where you adjust the flare nozzle to or the lock line tubing. Just let it come straight out. You obviously don't want the flare nozzle or the lock line to be pointed above the water line. Put it just below the water line, enough so that you can see some ripples on the surface of the water. That will help with gas exchange and evaporative cooling. The only other consideration when thinking about what direction to point that flare nozzle or that lock line from the return pump is just watching that sand bed. Depending on what kind of sand you bought, you may need to make adjustments because it may have too much flow in one direction that will cause sand to go everywhere. So just watch it over the next 24 hours and move that flare nozzle or that lock line tubing into a different direction if you're running into that problem. Okay, this obviously goes without saying, but I didn't mention it. You've attached the return pump, you've attached the flexible tubing, you've attached the lock line or the flare nozzle. Just make sure you plug it in so that the water is going through the mechanical filtration. Step number 7 is set up the auto top-off unit. If you didn't buy one, it's not a big deal, but now that the tank is running, you're going to notice evaporation every day. And if you don't replace that evaporated water with RODI water, that rear filtration chamber, the one that has the return pump, will run dry very quickly. So if you didn't buy the auto top off unit, it's not a big deal. Just pick up a pitcher and be sure to top off the tank every day. And the way you know if you have enough water is you look in that rear filtration chamber, specifically the compartment that has the return pump. That is the only compartment that will fluctuate the water height. You don't want that water height to get too low. So what I like to do is I like to fill it up just to the height of the baffle next to it. You can always overfill it a little bit. That will give you a little bit more time. But if you did buy an auto top-off unit, this is a really great time to set it up now because it will just make your life a lot simpler. There are so many different kinds of auto top-off units out there, but whichever one you bought, you want to make sure that you attach the sensor in the correct compartment. For complete beginners out there, they may not fully understand that the only compartment that fluctuates water height is the last compartment in your rear filtration chamber that contains the return pump. all the other ones will remain at a constant height. So if you were to place an auto top-off unit into one of those other compartments, it would never turn on because that water height's going to stay the same, at least until the compartment that has the return pump runs completely dry. So be sure when placing the sensor for the auto top-off unit, you place it in the same compartment that houses the return pump. Then just follow the instructions, attach the flexible tubing, and put the pump into a 5-gallon bucket. It's probably best practice to put a lid on that 5-gallon bucket because that will help stop the evaporation. And you can just drill a hole in the top of the lid, or you can just gently put the lid on top of the flexible tubing. And step number 8 is just a little tip for you. If you did buy a protein skimmer, don't set it up yet. We're not going to use a protein skimmer until later down the line. And also, if you have your lights set up already, leave them off. If you turn on lights just for a little while to look at your tank, like over here, this is totally fine. This tank, I don't have my lights on. I just have the lights on for the video, but I don't have any livestock, no macroalgae in there. But you want to leave those lights off the majority of the time because all that's going to happen is it's going to cause nuisance algae growth. And for that protein skimmer, you just want to leave it off or just don't install it yet. And the reason is because we are going to be adding nitrifying bacteria soon, and we don't want that protein skimmer to suck all that stuff up. Plus, there's really nothing in the tank that needs a protein skimmer at this point. I told you this video was super basic and super boring. But if you're a beginner, a true beginner, I hope you found it helpful. Be sure to tune in next week. We're moving on to week 17, everything you need to know about how to cycle your aquarium. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to My First Fish Tank and to Marine Depot. And as always, be well, happy reefing, take care. We'll see you next week, everybody.